It's the 60s, and now there's a war with no clear enemy, filmed every day to be shown to the families back home at night. A war between a native-born guerrilla and a foreign soldier. Wait, no, not that one. I mean the Aden Emergency. Now, before we hop into the Aden Emergency, let's first get some context on this colony. Now, the city of Aden had been under the rule of the British since 1839. From this little outpost, Britain would begin to flex its muscle and form relationships with the local sultanates, forming the Aden Protectorate. Now, this protectorate was especially protected when the Suez Canal was made, and it probably didn't help the British that the Ottoman Empire and Yemen was pretty close to Aden. Now, the protectorate was especially used by the British as a connecting point for their empire, connecting Britain to her colonies in Southeast Asia, especially the colony of British India. But now we're going to skip over a lot of that history and just go to about the end of World War II. Where anti-colonial ideas were sweeping across the world. Whatever empire you were, British, French, Dutch, it didn't matter. The rise of nationalism and anti-colonial thoughts were sweeping across the world, and the destruction of Europe from World War II did nothing but help accelerate these nationalist movements. And throughout the 1950s and 60s, the Arab world, especially in the Middle East, anti-colonial thoughts, especially Arab nationalism, would begin to gain a lot of momentum. In the 50s, one of the strongest Arab nations, Egypt, would actually see a coup led by Arab nationalists. And from that day on, Arab nationalism would really begin to pick up across the Arab world. And with people like Gamal Abdel Nasser and events like the Suez Crisis, you would really see Arab nationalism take off, as you would see coups across the Arab world. From Libya to now South Yemen, Arab nationalism was beginning to pick up a lot of momentum. Now, the British government began to realize the situation they were in, and would actually state their intentions of leaving South Yemen and granting it independence. Now, the British before had worked on trying to make these protectorate states into a pro-British independent federation among the British-aligned Yemeni tribes in the 50s with no success. But now that Arab nationalism and anti-colonial thoughts were becoming pretty big in the Arab world, these Arab sultanates would begin to revive this idea of a federation, as many of these Arab nationalist groups and political dissidents began to see these sultanates as nothing but British puppets, who really wouldn't usher in any actual change to the region. Now, I'm for sure that the sultans of course didn't see it this way, and for sure didn't like this, and in the 1960s they would form the Federation of South Arabia. But some of the eastern sultanates wouldn't join this federation, and they would form the Protectorate of South Arabia. So yes, now we have two Arabias bordering each other while also bordering Saudi Arabia, which is totally not confusing at all on a map. But whatever my tangents are about these Arabias in southern Yemen, and is that a part of Yemen? You know what, it's confusing, huh? But back to the video. Whatever federations or protectorates that were being made, Arab nationalism and Arab nationalist groups were still spreading across the Arab world and now in the Arabian Peninsula, and in this case, they're now making their way into southern Yemen. Within the general Yemeni region, that one would disintegrate into a state of civil war after a botched coup was initiated by Arab nationalists against the king. This war would be called the North Yemeni Civil War, and it's actually pretty interesting. This war, I think, is considered Egypt's Vietnam. Totally not reflective of Saudi Arabia in any way. But back to the video, huh? Within the southern Yemeni region, you would see Arab nationalist and anti-British sentiment really kick off. From here, you would see the formation of paramilitary groups like the more Marxist-Leninist leaning National Liberation Front, aka NLF, while you would also see the rise of the Arab nationalist group, the Front for the Liberation of Occupied South Yemen, also known as FLOSSY. Now, these paramilitary forces, especially the NLF, would lead an insurgency in the Radfan region against British authorities. And as the Radfan insurgency continued, these groups would begin to make their way into Aden. And in 1964, you would see an assassination attempt against one of the British High Commission officers. This attack was most likely perpetrated by the NLF. And following this grenade attack, Aden would be placed under a state of emergency, officially kicking off the Aden Emergency, also known as the Radfan Uprising. Now, big surprise here, but the proclamation of the state of emergency in Aden didn't end the whole anti-British insurgency in South Yemen. Protests, riots, grenade attacks, hit-and-run attacks, and assassinations, especially in Aden, would begin to take its toll on British troops and allied Yemeni forces based in Aden, as now the British government and these Yemeni paramilitary forces would find themselves fighting in a battle of cat and mouse. This doesn't mean that Yemeni forces weren't hurting. The NLF and FLOSSY would at times find themselves having clashes between each other, and the fact that British authorities were looking for them probably didn't help these groups at all. Now, the insurgency, especially the British counterinsurgency tactics, would begin to take its toll on Yemeni civilians. Like I've already stated, the assassination, bombing, rioting, and now the numerous British checkpoints and British troops stopping and searching suspected Yemeni insurgents, and British troops torturing suspected Yemeni insurgents, most likely began to rub a bunch of Yemenis the wrong way. To put it short, harsh British counterinsurgency tactics and policies would begin to cause resentment among the civilians, and tensions would explode when pro-British Yemeni police officers would lead armed insurrections against British forces in Crater, Aden. They would kick out the British and allow NLF and Flossie fighters to enter their domain, where then the NLF and Flossie fighters would begin to fight each other for control over the city. Now, the mutiny of the Crater would highlight British inability to halt the insurgencies, and Arab nationalist-like rebellions would break out in the sultanates, and throughout the summer, the sultanates and their sultans would collapse. And at the same time, British soldiers were pulled back to Aden to prepare for the withdrawal from southern Yemen. Now, the British government's initial response to the fall of the crater was to surround the crater and place snipers above, shooting into the area, targeting suspected Yemeni insurgents, while SAS units moved into crater where they would hunt down suspected Yemeni targets. To Lieutenant Colonel Colin Mitchell led a regiment into Crater and took over the city with almost no casualties, well, excluding when they accidentally shot a SAS member in the foot while he was on a assassination operation. Now, Colonel Mitchell is what some people would call a mad lad, since he took over this whole place with almost no casualties in practically about a day, and he probably was pretty lax about torture, but whatever opinions people have on this guy, the Crater would quickly fall back into the control of the British government due to his action. Now, the British government had already stated that they were going to leave South Yemen. The British Empire would begin to see this more as the British Empire leaving than the British government having to fight off a whole war. And when Crater was finally put under control, it fell right back into its general insurgency type thing. As the British government stated withdrawal date got closer, the British government would recognize the leader of the NLF, Qadani al-Shabi, as the first president of Yemen. In the following days, the British Empire would leave southern Yemen, granting independence to South Yemen. The NLF group would then create the People's Republic of South Yemen, and in the following years, hardline Marxist-Leninist NLF members would lead a coup ousting al-Shabi and creating the Marxist-Leninist state, which was Soviet-aligned during the Cold War.